There were no candles at my birthday party, just the crisp edge of a contract under the tablecloth. "This isn't a birthday," my fiancé, a former SEAL, murmured, his gaze sweeping over the outsourced security detail. "It's a setup. When they asked me to raise a glass, I understood. They needed me to take the fall for a black hole in the company's finances." I smiled. They thought I was here to celebrate. I was here to end it. "My name is Sloane Keaton. At 29, I am the Director of Risk Management for ArcLight Meridian, a tech logistics firm where the Calder family, my future in-laws, are majority shareholders. Tonight, I stood in the heart of their Graybridge estate, a monument to minimalist wealth where everything, from the art on the walls to the emotions on display, felt curated and cold. The air, thick with the scent of cedarwood from a dozen hidden diffusers, was supposed to feel calming. It felt like a tomb. Giant white chandeliers, like frozen sea creatures, hung suspended over the marble floors. They cast a sterile, shadowless light on the faces of the family members scattered across the great room. There were no balloons, no festive banners, not a single carelessly wrapped gift in sight. This was no birthday party. It was an arraignment disguised as a celebration. Beside me, Cole Rayner stood as a pillar of calm in the churning sea of tension. My fiancé, a former Navy SEAL, now transitioning to the civilian world by pursuing a master's in cybersecurity. He saw the world in vectors, threat assessments, and patterns of behavior. While others saw a cocktail party, he saw a tactical map. His eyes, a shade of blue that could be either serene or stormy, weren't fixed on the people but on their movements. He was tracking the hired security guards, their rhythmic patrols, a language he understood intimately. He watched them the way a predator watches its prey, counting their steps, timing their rotations, noting the slight bulge of a holster under a poorly tailored jacket. 11 minutes, 45 seconds on their rotation, he had murmured to me earlier, his voice a low vibration against my ear as he handed me a glass of champagne I had no intention of drinking. Too rigid for standard event security. They're running a containment pattern. Now the pretense was beginning to crumble. The curated playlist of inoffensive jazz faded into an unnerving silence. A subtle click echoed from the far end of the room as the French doors leading to the patio were quietly locked. A new pair of guards, men with the thick necks and dead eyes of professionals, materialized from the hallway and took up positions flanking the ornate bar. They weren't serving drinks. They were cutting off an exit. Cole's fingers brushed against my wrist, a light, almost imperceptible touch that conveyed a clear message. The exits are narrowing. They're boxing us in. Vivian Calder, Cole's aunt and the interim CFO of ArcLight, glided to the center of the room. She was a woman sculpted from ice and ambition, her smile as sharp and thin as a shard of glass. She held a pristine white envelope in her manicured hand. "Sloane, dear," she began, her voice resonating with a practiced warmth that never reached her eyes. "We decided to forgo the usual gifts this year. Instead, we have something a bit more significant, a chance for a clean slate." She extended the envelope. It wasn't a birthday card. The weight of it, the formal fold, screamed corporate document. My hand was steady as I took it. My heart, a cold, hard knot in my chest, did not betray its frantic rhythm. I didn't need to open it to know what was inside. This was the culmination of weeks of subtle exclusion, of coded emails and canceled meetings. This was the ambush. I broke the seal. Inside, as expected, there were 2 documents. The first was a voluntary resignation and severance agreement. The severance package was a joke, a symbolic figure that was more insulting than offering nothing at all. The second document was the real payload, a statement of acknowledgement. It was a confession, carefully worded by lawyers, admitting to gross negligence and professional misconduct. Their story was laid out in cold, clinical detail. According to them, I, Sloane Keaton, had personally approved a series of contracts with a phantom vendor, a shell corporation named Northway Courier LLC. This phantom vendor had siphoned off a significant portion of the logistics budget for the second quarter, creating a financial black hole that now threatened the company's stability. They had built a neat, tidy narrative with a single, convenient villain: me. My eyes scanned the pages, absorbing the legalese, the fabricated sequence of events, and then I saw it. At the bottom of the confession, above the line where my signature was supposed to go, a scanned image of my signature, lifted from some other document, was already there. They hadn't even waited for me to sign. They had presented it as a done deal. A flicker of rage, hot and pure, threatened to break through my composure, but I forced it down, replaced it with cold, sharp analysis. The signature was good, but it wasn't perfect. They had made a mistake, a small, almost imperceptible one, but to me, it was as glaring as a flare in the night. The final stroke of the K in Keaton. My signature always had a sharp, decisive uptick at the end of the K. It was a habit ingrained since I first learned to sign my name. This forgery had a slight tremor, a wavering line of someone trying to replicate, not create. It was the mark of a hesitant hand, a forger's tell. I never, ever write my K like that. As you can see, Vivian said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, the evidence is overwhelming. This is simply a formality to protect the company, to protect the family. On cue, Beck Calder, Cole's cousin and ArcLight's COO, stepped forward. Beck was everything Cole was not: soft, entitled, with a politician's smile that never quite masked the weakness in his eyes. He held a small remote, and with a click, a projector screen hummed to life on the far wall. "We've prepared a brief overview," Beck announced, his tone self-important, as if he were unveiling a revolutionary new product. An elaborate flowchart appeared on the screen. It was a tangled web of arrows and boxes, designed to confuse and intimidate. Red lines traced a path from a series of invoices to a bank account in Delaware, and culminated in a box with my digital signature plastered inside it. My name, in bold red letters, was at the center of the web, the architect of the company's near ruin. It was a masterpiece of corporate fiction, designed to be presented to a board of directors as an open and shut case. The room was silent, the assembled family members watching me, their expressions a mixture of feigned disappointment and morbid curiosity. They were waiting for me to break, to cry, to protest my innocence in a way that would only confirm my guilt in their eyes. I held my ground, my expression a carefully constructed mask of troubled concern. My mind was racing, cataloging every detail, every lie, every tactical error they were making. They thought they were in control. They thought their trap had sprung perfectly. Cole leaned in close, his body a warm, solid shield between me and the rest of the room. His breath was a whisper against my hair, his voice low and for my ears only. "Left corner of the display," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the projected image. "The metadata strip, they cropped out the timestamp. Sloppy." He paused, his gaze shifting from the screen to my face, a question in his eyes. "You have something they aren't expecting, right?" A slow smile touched my lips, a genuine one this time. It was a smile that promised a reckoning. They had built their narrative on a foundation of lies, backed by fabricated evidence and a forged signature. They thought they had cornered me. They didn't realize they had just walked into a trap of my own. "Oh, yes," I whispered back. "They have no idea." The projected chart on the wall swam before my eyes, a monument to their calculated deception. Beck's smug face was illuminated by its glow. But I wasn't looking at him. I was looking through him, through the walls of this sterile mansion, and into the past that had led us all to this moment. This was the Calder way. They didn't have family dinners. They had quarterly reviews. I remembered one gathering a few months after Cole and I got engaged. We were all assembled in the formal dining room, not around a turkey, but around a holographic projector displaying the latest revenue projections. Grandfather Calder, the family patriarch, had raised a glass of scotch not to our health, but to a 7% increase in market share. They took a photo that night, all of them smiling with their teeth. standing beside a bar graph as if it were a beloved relative. That photo ran in a trade magazine a week later with the caption, "The Calders, a family that builds together." It was the perfect encapsulation of their ethos. Family wasn't a bond, it was a brand. And I was never part of that brand. Vivian, now circling the room like a shark sensing blood, had made that clear from day one. It didn't matter that Cole loved me, or that I had poured my life into protecting their company. Last year, when a massive data breach originating from a third-party vendor threatened to cripple ArcLight and expose them to a 9-figure lawsuit, I was the one who worked for 72 hours straight, tracing the digital footprints, isolating the compromised servers, and authoring the containment protocol that saved them. I had navigated the legal minefield, placated their biggest clients, and rebuilt their shattered security framework from the ground up. I had saved them from their own complacency. In any sane world, that would have earned me a seat at the table. In the Calder world, it only solidified my status as the outsider. I wasn't family. I was a competent, and therefore dangerous, employee. They could appreciate my results, but they would never trust the person who delivered them. They saw my efficiency not as an asset, but as an unsettling deviation from their world of inherited titles and boardroom politics. Beck, now gesturing at his fraudulent chart with the flourish of a magician, was the chief evangelist of the family brand. His office was littered with motivational posters of his own design, featuring dramatic landscapes and pithy corporate slogans. His favorite, printed in a bold, authoritative font over an image of a soaring eagle, was "Family is Priority 1." He had sent out a company-wide memo with that poster as the header just last month, announcing a new, family-focused corporate wellness initiative. The hypocrisy was so profound, it was almost an art form. This was the same man who would trample over his own mother for a better title, the same man who saw his cousins not as relatives, but as competitors on a dynastic ladder. Family First was a slogan for the employees, a tool to foster loyalty and discourage dissent. For the Calders themselves, the only priority was power. Cole was the exception, the genetic anomaly in the Calder line. He had escaped their world by enlisting, by trading the sterile battlefields of the boardroom for the very real ones in Afghanistan and Iraq. He had seen true loyalty, forged in chaos and fire, and it had made him allergic to the polished, empty rhetoric that filled rooms like this. He hated the way they used words like synergy and optimization to mask their greed, the way they spoke of family while sharpening their knives. He had come home a different man, one who couldn't unsee the rot beneath the gilded surface of his family's empire. He was my anchor, the one person in this house who saw things as they were, not as they were presented. My strength, however, came from another source, my adoptive father, a quiet man who had built a successful engineering firm from nothing, had taught me everything I knew about power. He wasn't a man for grand gestures or performative authority. I remember sitting in his workshop as a child, watching him meticulously calibrate a piece of equipment. He looked up at me and said something I never forgot. "Sloan, never mistake noise for influence. Real power doesn't need a backdrop. It's quiet. It's precise. It's the gear that turns the whole machine, not the whistle that announces it's running." The Calders were all backdrop, all noise. Their power was a performance. Mine was a quiet, unyielding fact. I had relied on that lesson 3 months ago. My risk analysis algorithms had flagged a series of anomalies: invoices from a new logistics vendor, Northway Courier LLC, that shared identical routing numbers and metadata with a dozen other, smaller payouts. The patterns were too clean, the data too perfect. It was a classic shell company scheme, elegant in its simplicity, but easily detectable if you knew where to look. I compiled a detailed report, flagging the transactions as high risk and recommending an immediate freeze on the account pending a forensic audit. I sent it directly to Vivian and Beck. The response was silence. A week later, I brought it up in our weekly executive meeting. Vivian cut me off, saying, We'll look into it. Sloan, let's stick to the agenda. The agenda, of course, was a lengthy discussion about the color palette for the new company website. My warnings were not just ignored, they were actively dismissed. Then the walls started closing in. A critical audit committee meeting was scheduled, and I was on the invite list. An hour before it was set to begin, I received an automated email from Beck's assistant. My attendance had been canceled due to a scheduling conflict. The conflict was a mandatory HR seminar on fostering interdepartmental synergy that had been added to my calendar 5 minutes earlier. It happened again the following week. This time, there was no excuse at all. I was simply removed from the meeting invite without explanation. They were cutting me out, ensuring my voice and my data would not be heard in the rooms where it mattered. The final, public humiliation came 2 weeks ago. Beck sent out a company-wide email announcing a new operational task force. In the list of members, my name appeared as Sloan Keaton, Acting Director of Risk Management. Acting, that single, passive-aggressive word, was a declaration of war. There had been no discussion, no official announcement, no change to my employment status. It was a subtle, deliberate move to undermine my authority in front of the entire company, to plant a seed of doubt about my position and my future. It was a message. You are temporary. You are disposable. That was the moment I stopped fighting them on their terms. My father's voice echoed in my mind. Don't wrestle with a pig. You get dirty. And besides, the pig likes it. I couldn't win in a public shouting match. They controlled the narrative, the meetings, the very language of the company, so I went quiet. I stopped sending emails about Northway. I didn't question the acting in my title. I smiled politely in the hallways, and I began my own investigation. While they were busy building their paper fortress of lies, I was collecting the digital bricks and mortar of the truth. I dove into the server logs, tracing every access request, every file modification, every digital signature. I compiled a timeline not of their fabricated story, in which I was the villain, but of the real one, the one hidden in the metadata and the server access records. I watched, silently, as they created the digital evidence that would ultimately be their undoing. Every move they made to frame me left a footprint. I was simply there to preserve it. When the invitation for my surprise birthday party arrived, I knew this was it, the final act. They would present their case in a controlled environment, surrounded by family, and pressure me into signing their confession. They were counting on the shock, the isolation, the sheer emotional weight of the betrayal to make me compliant. That's why I asked Cole to come, not as my fiancé, but as my witness, as my tactical advisor, as the one person who would see the locked doors and the hired guards not as party logistics, but as the tactical maneuvers they were. He was the ground truth in a house built on illusions. I walked into my own ambush tonight not as a victim, but as a counterintelligence operative. They thought they had set the perfect trap. They had, just not for me. The world narrowed to the forged signature on the page in my hand. It was a clumsy imitation, but the intent behind it was murderously clear. They weren't just trying to fire me, they were trying to erase me, to overwrite my career and my reputation with a narrative of their own making. Every detail of this room, this night, was a weapon pointed in my direction, but a weapon can be turned against its wielder. While Vivian spoke, Cole's focus remained on the perimeter. His analysis of the scene came in low, clipped transmissions, audible only to me. 12-minute rotation, he had murmured earlier, his eyes tracking a guard passing the large bay window. It's not a random patrol, it's a timed loop. That's the signature of a short-term contractor. Not the family's regular detail. They're cheaping out. They expected this to be over fast. His assessment was a scalpel, dissecting their strategy. They hadn't planned for a siege. They had planned for a summary execution. They didn't think I would fight back. My own gaze drifted to a side table, where the ceremonial birthday cake sat, untouched. It was a perfect, 3-tiered confection covered in a flawless sheet of white fondant. It was beautiful, architectural, and completely sterile. There was no "Happy Birthday Sloan" piped in cheerful icing, no candles waiting to be lit. It was a prop, an object meant to signify celebration without containing any of its warmth or spontaneity. It was a cake for a photo shoot, not for a person. Like everything else in this house, it was an illusion of family, hollow at its core. The illusion had been cracking all day. I just hadn't had all the pieces until now. When we first arrived, Beck had greeted Cole with an overly enthusiastic handshake, a display of familial bonhomie that was entirely unconvincing. Cole, however, used the contact to his advantage. His gaze had flickered down for a fraction of a second to Beck's phone, which had lit up on the console table beside them. Later. As Vivian began her speech, Cole leaned toward me, his lips barely moving. Saw Beck's lock screen when we came in. Calendar notification. The event was edited at 15:04 today. The title was changed from Sloane's birthday celebration to Calder Family Meeting, Urgent. They couldn't even maintain the lie in their own digital calendars. The pretense was only skin deep, a hastily applied veneer over their true intentions. Even the hired help was part of the script. The catering staff, usually a familiar team who had worked Calder events for years, were all new faces. They were efficient but impersonal, moving through the room with the detached air of temps. When one of them offered me an hors d'oeuvre, he had said, "For you, Ms. Keaton," not Sloane. For the past 2 years, every staff member in this house had been told to call me Sloane. The shift to the formal Ms. Keaton was a subtle but significant demotion. It was a signal that I was no longer being treated as future family, but as an outsider, a subject of a corporate action. They were dehumanizing me by degrees. My eyes found the projector, standing ready on its tripod. The fan whirred almost silently, the lens a single, unblinking eye aimed at the blank screen, but the thick, black HDMI cable that should have connected it to Beck's laptop lay in a neat coil on the floor beside it. It was a deliberate, 2-stage attack. First, the shock of the envelope, the personal betrayal, the emotional blow. Then, once I was disoriented and reeling, Beck would connect the cable and deliver the second strike, the fabricated evidence, the public humiliation. It was a classic interrogation tactic. Emotional compromise followed by overwhelming data, amateurish, but potentially effective against an unprepared target. I looked back down at the envelope in my hands. The paper was thick, expensive linen stock, meant to convey importance, but the seal was a piece of clear office tape, slightly wrinkled at the edge. The Calders, obsessed with optics and branding, would never use something so common for an official document of this magnitude. A matter of family honor, of corporate life and death, would have been sealed with wax, embossed with the family crest. The tape spoke of haste. It spoke of an office, not a drawing room. It meant this package had been assembled quickly, likely by Beck himself, and was designed to be opened and perhaps even altered at a moment's notice. It wasn't an official document. It was a weapon of convenience. Vivian's words from minutes before echoed in my mind, replaying themselves with a new, chilling clarity. "Above all else, this family values loyalty," she had declared, her gaze sweeping the room. "It is the bedrock upon which our brand integrity is built." The order was wrong. A person of true conviction puts their principles first. A corporate animal puts the brand first. For Vivian, brand integrity wasn't built on loyalty. Loyalty was a resource to be exploited for the brand. Her placing loyalty first was a clumsy attempt at emotional manipulation, a line from a script she thought I wanted to hear. It was a tell, as clear as a stacked deck. In the back of the room, half hidden in the shadows near a towering fiddle-leaf fig, sat a man I had never seen before. He was in his late 40s, with a nondescript gray suit and an air of nervous energy. He hadn't been introduced. He wasn't family, not a friend, not one of their usual corporate attorneys from the white shoe firm they kept on retainer. His shoes gave him away. They were expensive black leather Oxfords, but they were too new, the soles too clean, and as he shifted his weight, the light caught a small, white paper sticker still clinging to the arch of his right sole. A barcode. He was a hired gun, brought in for this specific task. A legal stranger who could be paid and dismissed without any lasting ties to the family. He was here to witness a signature, not to offer counsel. He was a disposable part of their disposable plan. My smartwatch vibrated against my wrist. A silent, haptic pulse. I glanced down. A message from Cole. Stark and efficient. Basement has a secondary exit near the machine room. Steel door. Leads to the east lawn. We can be gone in 90 seconds. His training, his instinct, was kicking in. The situation had turned hostile. The objective was to secure the principal, me, and extract to a safe location. It was the logical, tactical move, the smart move, for a soldier. But this wasn't his battlefield. It was mine. I looked across the room at the faces watching me. Vivian's triumphant smirk, Beck's nervous anticipation, the rest of them, the cousins and uncles, vultures waiting for the kill. They thought they had me. They thought I was surrounded. They didn't understand the nature of power in this world. It wasn't about escape routes and physical threats. It was about information, leverage, and the narrative. Running away would be an admission of guilt. It would hand them the victory they so desperately craved. My fingers moved across the small screen of my watch, typing a reply. I didn't need to look at Cole to know he would understand. Don't need an exit, need an audience. His hand, resting on the small of my back, gave a single, firm squeeze. Message received. He was no longer my rescuer. He was my reinforcement. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. But the steel jaws were about to snap shut on the hunters. Not the hunted. They were waiting for my response, for the tears or the rage, the predictable emotional outburst of a cornered animal. They didn't understand that I hadn't been cornered. For the past 3 weeks, since the moment Beck had added the word acting to my title, I had been the one building the cage. This party wasn't their trap for me. It was my proving ground for them. My actions over the last 72 hours had been a cold, strategic deployment of assets, a secret to-do list for dismantling an empire from within. First, I had targeted their digital high ground. 2 weeks ago, I anticipated they would need to falsify records in the contract management system. They would need to create a digital trail that led to me. So, late one night, using my administrative privileges they hadn't yet thought to revoke, I accessed the staging environment of the dashboard. It's where developers test changes before pushing them live. A sandbox that is rarely monitored with the same rigor as the live system. There, I embedded a simple, elegant piece of logging software. It was designed to do one thing: record every keystroke, every file modification, and the originating IP address of any user who accessed a specific set of vendor files, namely, the newly created and highly suspicious Northway Courier LLC. They would be building their evidence in what they thought was a secure workshop, never knowing that the foreman was taking notes. Second, I needed to confirm the lead conspirator. While I suspected Beck was the hand, Vivian was the brain. To prove it, I crafted a weapon disguised as a calendar invitation. I created a fake mandatory audit review for the Northway account and sent it only to a handful of senior managers, including Beck and Vivian. The invitation itself was irrelevant. Embedded in the email's body was a 1-1 tracking pixel, invisible to the naked eye. This tiny digital snitch would ping my private server every time the email was opened, logging the IP address, time, and location of the viewer. Over the next 48 hours, the pixel was triggered 17 times. 15 of those triggers came from the same IP address, one hardwired to the executive suite at ArcLight headquarters, specifically the corner office belonging to Vivian Calder. The other 2 came from Beck's home network. She was the architect. He was the eager apprentice. Third, I addressed the physical evidence they would inevitably present tonight. The confession. I knew they would draft something for me to sign, so I drafted my own. I created 2 identical-looking versions of a statement of acknowledgement. The first was the bait. I used a high-resolution scan of my signature, the same flawed, slightly shaky one from their document, and placed it at the bottom. This was the version I would allow them to see first, the one that would make them believe I was capitulating. The second version, however, was my real weapon, printed on the same paper stock. It was embedded with a forensic watermark, a pattern of microdots invisible under normal light but clearly legible under a UV source or when magnified on a projector. The watermark read, "Forensic copy, property of Sloan Keaton, log 2004. It was a document designed not to confess, but to accuse. Fourth, Cole had his mission. When we arrived, he had complained about the cedarwood scent triggering his allergies, a complete fabrication. He'd excused himself to the coat room to find an antihistamine in his jacket. The room, conveniently adjacent to the main hall, was empty. It took him less than 30 seconds. The target was a discreet, high-end tissue box placed on a console table near the makeshift podium where Vivian now stood. Inside, nestled among the tissues, was a voice-activated micro-recorder, no bigger than a sugar cube, with a 12-hour battery life. It was now capturing every triumphant whisper, every self-incriminating instruction, every word they thought was being spoken in the privacy of their inner circle. Fifth, I expanded the audience beyond this room. Before leaving home, I used a secure anonymous email service to send a message to Melissa Tran, a sharp, hungry business reporter at the Graybridge Chronicle who had been covering ArcLight for years. The message was brief and tantalizing. Source suggests ArcLight Meridian will announce a bold new corporate transparency policy at a private Calder family event tonight. Major executive shifts expected. Might be worth keeping an ear out. It was a shot in the dark, but a calculated one. I wasn't just creating a threat. I was framing my counterattack in the language of corporate governance. When the dust settled, my actions wouldn't be seen as revenge, but as a necessary, if dramatic, step towards transparency. Sixth, I mobilized my internal allies without revealing my hand. I sent a carefully worded email to ArcLight's internal legal counsel, CCing the head of human resources. The subject line was urgent, request for procedural clarification. In it, I requested an immediate and standing review of any documentation related to an executive-level separation agreement that might be circulated that evening, citing a need to ensure full compliance with SEC regulations. This forced them to be on high alert. They were now sitting by their laptops, legally obligated to scrutinize any document Vivian or Beck tried to push through the system. They were a remote legal team, waiting in the wings, and the Calders had no idea. Seventh, I created my insurance policy, a dead man's switch. On my personal laptop, I had compiled a password-protected zip file. It contained everything: the server logs from my tracking tool, the IP data from the tracking pixel, my original report on Northway that Vivian and Beck had buried, and a detailed timeline of their efforts to exclude me from key meetings. I had set up an automated script. If my phone, currently in my clutch, did not connect to a known Wi-Fi network or ping a cell tower for a continuous period of 15 minutes, the script would execute. It would automatically email that encrypted file, along with the password, to the company's general counsel, the board of directors' independent audit committee, and Melissa Tran at the Chronicle. If they took my phone, if they tried to remove me physically, the evidence would be disseminated instantly. My silence would trigger the alarm. Eighth, I had studied my enemy's signature. My adoptive father, in his meticulous way, had kept notebooks on the people he did business with, filled with observations on their habits and tells. He believed you could learn more from a man's signature under pressure than from an hour of conversation. I had his notebook on the Calders. He had noted that Vivian, in moments of haste or stress, always elongated the final stroke of the letter V in her name, a subconscious flourish of impatience. I had studied the forgery on their document. The K was wrong, but I was now watching Vivian, imagining the moment I would force her to sign my document, and I knew I would be looking for that long, sharp V. Ninth, I had poisoned their own weapon. Knowing they would use a projector, I had accessed the shared network drive where the marketing department stored its official PowerPoint templates. I didn't alter the design, but I embedded a simple macro into the template's master slide. The macro was dormant, invisible. But when any presentation using that template was put into slideshow mode, the macro would execute a single command. It would override any cropped or hidden elements and display the file's complete, unalterable metadata in the bottom left corner of the screen. This included the file's author, the computer it was created on, and most importantly, the true timestamp of its last modification. Beck was about to present his fabricated evidence using a Trojan horse of my own design, which led to my final, and most critical, strategic decision. I would wait. I stood there, the weight of their fraudulent document in my hand, and I held my tongue. The first principle of a successful ambush is to let your opponent reveal their entire strategy. Let them march their whole army into the kill zone. They needed to state their case, present their forged evidence, and commit themselves fully and publicly to this lie. I needed them to tell their story, in their own words, captured on Cole's recorder, for all the world to hear. I would let them build their gallows, board by board, before I revealed that the noose was, in fact, for them. I let the silence hang in the air, a heavy blanket woven from their expectation and my calculated calm. Vivian, sensing a need to reassert control, stepped forward. Her posture was a study in practiced authority, her voice pitched to a level of grave sincerity. "This is unpleasant for all of us," she began, her gaze sweeping over the assembled family members and landing on me with a look of profound disappointment. "But we are in a crisis that threatens the very foundation of this company, of this family, and the only way to extinguish a crisis like this is with accountability." The word hung in the air, thick with hypocrisy, accountability. Their version of it was a scapegoat, a clean, swift execution to cauterize a wound they had inflicted upon themselves. "Beck," Vivian said, nodding toward her nephew. "Show her." Beck, looking relieved to have a task, fumbled for a moment before firmly plugging the HDMI cable into his laptop. The projector whirred, and the blank screen on the wall came to life. His fraudulent flowchart, a convoluted web of lies designed to ensnare me, filled the space. Red arrows pointed accusingly toward my name, which was highlighted in a box at the center. It was visually damning, a prepackaged narrative of guilt. He cleared his throat, ready to begin his narration, to walk them all through my supposed crimes. But before he could utter a single word, my hidden macro executed. In the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, a small, unobtrusive line of text appeared in the template's default font. It was barely noticeable, the kind of file information most people would ignore, but to me, it was a flare of light in a dark room. It read, "File path. C/users.bcalder/documents. Internal review ESC. PPTX. Last modified. 10/14/2025. 02/13/17 AM. AM. Author, Beck Calder." I let him talk for a moment, letting him weave his fiction, letting him commit more deeply to the lie. He pointed to a box. As you can see, the initial unauthorized wire transfer was routed from this account, an account that only Sloan had the authorization to. I raised a hand, not to object, but as if asking a simple clarifying question, I tilted my head, my expression a carefully crafted mask of confusion. "I'm sorry. Beck, could you go back one moment? Something on the screen is confusing me." He stopped, thrown off his rhythm. "What is it?" "Down in the corner," I said, pointing. "That line of text. I'm just trying to understand the data. It says the file was last modified at 2:13 this morning. From your user account. That's strange, isn't it? Especially since my system logs show my own credentials haven't been accessed since 5 p.m. yesterday. I'm just wondering, why would my official performance review file be modified from your office IP address in the middle of the night?" A ripple of unease went through the room. Beck's face went pale, his eyes darting from me to the screen and back again. He opened his mouth, but only a faint stammer emerged. The man in the gray suit, the anonymous lawyer, stepped forward from the shadows. Let's not get bogged down in technicalities, he said, his voice smooth but firm. The substance of the matter is what's important here. A low, humorless laugh came from beside me. Cole. He hadn't moved, but his presence seemed to fill the space. Technicalities, he said, his voice quiet but carrying the cold authority of a command. In my world, we call those facts, and in a room like this, technicalities are the only things that don't lie. The lawyer recoiled as if struck. The air crackled. The momentum had shifted. I let my shoulders slump, playing the part they had cast for me. I looked down at the documents in my hand. Their confession. I slowly pulled out the bait copy, the one with the forged signature already on it. I let it tremble slightly in my hand. Vivian saw the movement, saw what she believed was my spirit breaking. Her relief was a physical thing, a visible loosening of the tension in her shoulders. "Sloane, dear," she said, her voice softening into a coo of false magnanimity. "It's over. Just sign the agreement. We can put this all behind us. It's for the good of the family." This was the moment, the precipice. Cole, as if on cue, turned to one of the new caterers standing stiffly by the wall. His voice wasn't a whisper. It was a clear, commanding request that cut through the tension and made everyone turn. "Excuse me," he said politely. "Could you please turn up the lights on the terrace? And perhaps open the doors? The atmosphere in here is a little thick. I think we all need to see each other's faces clearly when we're being this honest." It was a brilliant disruption. The caterer, startled, nodded and moved to the control panel as a bank of bright, cold light flooded the room from the outside, momentarily dazzling everyone. Vivian saw her opening. She leaned in toward Beck, who was still frozen by the projector. Her voice was a venomous whisper, meant only for him, but the tiny microphone in the tissue box was a silent, perfect witness. "Get her to sign it now," the whisper hissed. "Just get the signature, and I'll have it lock her out of the system completely. End it." I didn't react. I let her words dissipate into the air, captured and stored. Then I moved. I ignored the document in my hand, the one she was so desperate for me to sign. I walked calmly to the projector stand, where a small document camera sat unused, intended for physical evidence. I took the second copy of the statement from my clutch, my true copy. I placed it under the lens. With a click, I changed the projector's input source. Beck's fraudulent chart vanished. In its place, an image of my document filled the screen. It looked identical to theirs, with one critical difference. I used the remote to zoom in on the bottom right corner of the page. Under the bright, unforgiving light of the projector, the invisible microdots of the watermark resolved into sharp, clear text. Forensic copy, 2004. Beside it, I had placed a printout of the server access logs, and I zoomed in on the damning line. Access denied. User B. Calder. File modification attempt. Northway. INV. 10 a.m. The air in the room didn't just get tense. It seemed to solidify. Breathing became a conscious effort. The family guests, who I now saw clearly were not just cousins and aunts, but also the head of logistics, the vice president of operations, and two senior division managers, stared at the screen. They had come here for a birthday party, an execution. They now realized they were witnesses to a boardroom coup, and they were on the wrong side of it. Their expressions shifted from smug certainty to pale, dawning horror. They exchanged nervous glances, their allegiance to the Calder name suddenly a liability, not a privilege. I turned from the screen and faced Vivian. My voice was calm, level, devoid of the emotion they had tried so hard to provoke. It was the voice of a risk manager stating an undeniable fact. "Vivian, you said this was about accountability," I said, letting each word land with the weight of a stone. "You said you wanted to extinguish a crisis. I agree." I let a beat of silence pass, holding her gaze. "So if this is a transparency session," I concluded, "I invite you to be transparent, all the way." The words, "forensic copy" burned on the screen. a digital brand marking the end of their narrative and the beginning of mine. The room was a vacuum, all the air sucked out by the sudden, stark revelation. I didn't give them a moment to recover, to regroup. I had the floor, and I intended to use it to systematically dismantle their world. "Let's start with the entity you created," I said, my voice steady as I clicked to a new file on the projector. A certificate of incorporation for a Delaware LLC appeared on the screen. Northway Courier LLC, a fine name, sounds established, trustworthy. I zoomed in on the section listing the registered agent. Registered just 4 months ago by one Amanda Riley. Does that name sound familiar? Beck? It should. She's your executive assistant. A gasp went through the room. Beck looked as if I had physically struck him. Amanda was a sweet, overworked young woman who idolized him. Using her name was a particular kind of cruelty, a betrayal I was now exposing. Now, let's look at the payment authorizations that Northway received. I continued, switching to a new screen. A series of high-value invoices and their corresponding payment orders filled the display. Each one bore a digital signature. Sloan Keaton. A very convincing forgery, at first glance, but you made a critical error. I zoomed in until a single signature filled the entire screen, the pixels becoming visible. You didn't scan my signature from a document. That would have been too risky. The resolution might have been off. Instead, you constructed it digitally. I brought up an overlay box showing the internal corporate font library. You used a modified version of the ArcLight Sans Pro font for the main body of the name, and then you manually drew the K with a stylus. The problem is, a font has a uniform pixel density. A scanned signature from an ink pen does not. The aliasing is all wrong. I highlighted the edges of the signature, where the faint, blocky steps of the pixels were now glaringly obvious. This isn't a signature, it's a graphic design project. As I spoke, I discreetly took out my phone and placed it on the podium. Its screen mirrored to the projector. A notification banner instantly appeared at the top of the display. It was a message from David Morrison, the head of our primary logistics warehouse. The message, sent via a secure intra-company channel, was visible for all to see. From Dr. Morrison to S. Keaton. Your query. Sloan. Confirmed. That batch of Northway payment authorizations from Q2 didn't come through your terminal. They were pushed through the system from an executive IP address. The logs show the user was B. Calder. The time was 02:13 a.m. this morning, just like you asked. Hope this helps. The message vanished after a few seconds, but its impact was devastating. It was a live, independent corroboration of the timestamp on the screen, a voice from outside this poisoned room speaking the truth. Vivian finally broke. The mask of calm shattered, replaced by a rictus of fury. "What do you think you're doing?" she snarled, her voice shaking with rage. "You are tearing this family apart. For what? To save your own skin?" I turned to face her. My own emotions a tightly coiled spring inside me. I let none of it show. "A family doesn't forge signatures on legal documents. Vivian," I said, my voice dropping to a low, intense level. "A family doesn't build a shell corporation in the name of a junior employee to embezzle funds. You're not a family. You're a conspiracy that happens to share a last name, and you use that name, that supposed bond of trust, to try and steal my future. That has nothing to do with family, and everything to do with fraud." Before Vivian could retort, Cole spoke. He hadn't raised his voice, but the quiet authority in it commanded the room's absolute attention. He was looking directly at Vivian. "You've always prided yourself on your mastery of Sarbanes-Oxley, haven't you, Aunt Vivian?" he said. "Especially Section 302, Corporate Responsibility for Financial Reports. You've quoted it in board meetings. It stipulates that the signing officers, the CEO and CFO, certify that they are responsible for establishing and maintaining internal controls, and have disclosed to the auditors and the audit committee of the board of directors all significant deficiencies in the design or operation of internal controls which could adversely affect the issuer's ability to record, process, summarize, and report financial data. He paused, letting the legal weight of his words sink in. As interim CFO, you just tried to coerce a signature to cover up a massive deficiency in those controls. A deficiency you and Beck created. That isn't just a policy violation, it's a federal crime. The anonymous lawyer in the gray suit began to quietly edge toward the door. I turned back to the projector. Speaking of the audit committee, I said, clicking my mouse. The view switched to my live email inbox. The sent folder was open. At the very top was an email, sent automatically 15 minutes after I had arrived. The timestamp was clearly visible. To General Counsel, Audit Committee Chair, Board of Directors, Distribution List. From Sloan Keaton. Subject, Urgent. Forensic Review of Northway Courier, LLC and request for formal investigation. My dead man's switch, I explained to the silent room. Programmed to send if I was detained or my communications were cut off. It contains everything. The server logs, the IP data, the original risk report you buried 3 months ago. The board has it all. The consequences are no longer in your hands. They are already in motion. That was the final blow for the assembled managers. The illusion of a family squabble evaporated, replaced by the cold reality of a corporate meltdown. One of them, the VP of Operations, muttered, "My God, the press will crucify us." Another manager frantically began typing on his phone, likely to his own lawyer. The conspiracy was fracturing, each member suddenly desperate to save themselves. Beck, white as a sheet, finally found his voice. It was a pathetic, reedy whisper. It wasn't like that, he stammered, looking at Vivian for help she couldn't provide. It was just a temporary rebalancing to cover the Q2 shortfall. We were going to fix it. Cole took a step forward. Rebalancing? He asked, the single word dripping with contempt. Or embezzlement? The word hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. Embezzlement, a federal crime. The room fell into a profound, deathly silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the projector. I let the silence stretch, letting them suffocate in the truth of what they had done. Beck's pathetic euphemism had been replaced by Cole's brutal reality. Finally, after a long, punishing moment, I turned back to the projector. "You're right, Vivian," I said. "This is a crisis, and it does require accountability, so I took the liberty of inviting a few more people to my party." I clicked on a video call link I had prepared. The screen flickered, and 2 new faces appeared, projected 10 feet high on the wall behind me. They were a man and a woman in their 50s, with grim professional expressions. They were not smiling. "Everyone," I announced to the stunned room, "I'd like you to meet Mark Cheneau and Eleanor Vance from our Internal Audit and Compliance Division. They've been waiting patiently online for the presentation to conclude. Mark, Eleanor, welcome to the party." The faces of Mark Cheneau and Eleanor Vance on the projector screen were impassive, their expressions those of coroners examining a body. They were not here to judge, merely to state the facts of the death. Mark Reddington spoke, and his voice, tinny and remote through the laptop's speakers, was the sound of a guillotine blade being released. "Given the evidence of financial irregularities and potential material misrepresentation presented in this meeting," he began, his tone utterly devoid of emotion, "Internal Audit, in accordance with corporate governance protocols, is recommending an immediate administrative freeze on all non-payroll disbursement functions originating from the office of the interim CFO, effective immediately. This is a precautionary measure pending the results of a full and immediate forensic investigation." The words were procedural, couched in the sterile language of compliance, but their effect was a dagger to the heart of Vivian's power. She controlled the flow of money. It was the source of her authority, the weapon she wielded. He had just disarmed her in front of her entire army. A flicker of pure, unadulterated panic crossed her face before being suppressed by a lifetime of practiced composure. She was now a queen without a treasury. I stepped into the silence. "The freeze is a necessary first step," I said, addressing not Vivian, but the room at large, the captive audience of managers and family members. But a freeze is a temporary measure. What we need, tonight, is a structural solution to contain the risk. I let my gaze settle on Vivian, pinning her in place. I have prepared a new acting resolution. It will be signed tonight by every Calder family member present with a board seat. This resolution will transfer all risk management oversight and all high-value payment authorization protocols directly to the office of the interim CEO. The CFO's office will be bypassed entirely until this investigation is concluded. This is not a negotiation. These are the terms of containment. The blood drained from Vivian's face. I had not only taken her checkbook, I had rerouted the entire financial nervous system of the company around her. I had made her irrelevant. For the first time, she looked not at the board members or the auditors, but directly at me, and her voice was a raw, desperate rasp. "What do you want? Sloan?" she asked. It was the question of a woman trying to find a price, to turn a principle into a transaction. "What will it take to make this stop?" I held her gaze. I did not want money. I did not want an apology in a quiet room. I wanted something far more valuable to me and far more costly to her. "The truth," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "I want the truth, right here, right now, in front of everyone." I turned away from her and picked up the wireless microphone from the small podium. I walked over to Beck, who seemed to be trying to shrink into himself, to become invisible. I held the microphone out to him. He flinched as if it were a snake. "Beck," I commanded, "the timestamp, the one on the screen from your presentation, I want you to read it into this microphone, for the record." He stared at me, his eyes wide with terror. He shook his head slightly. Cole took a single, silent step toward him, and it was all the motivation Beck needed. His trembling hand took the microphone. He lifted it to his lips, his breath catching in his throat. "Please," he whispered. "Read it," I said. He swallowed hard. The microphone amplified the sound, making it echo through the silent room. He leaned in, his eyes fixed on the damning numbers projected on the wall. His voice was a choked, broken thing, the sound of a man confessing to his own execution. 2:13 a.m., he whispered. Every person in the room heard it. Every person understood. It was a public confession, stripped of all legal jargon. It was the simple, ugly truth. "Thank you, Beck," I said. Taking the microphone back, I turned to the rest of the family. The Calder family prides itself on its ability to take swift, decisive action. We will do so now. As if on cue, Cole moved to the side table, where the untouched, nameless birthday cake sat like a monument to their failed ambush. Beside it was a single, elegantly wrapped gift box, the only one in the room. He picked it up. It was not a gift. It was an arsenal. He opened the box and removed a stack of documents, professionally bound. "A draft of the acting resolution Sloan just described," he announced, his voice calm and clear. "With copies for every board-level family member present, it's ready for your signatures." He began to hand them out, his movements efficient and deliberate. The family members took them with hesitant, numb fingers, as if being served with their own indictments. As the reality of the situation settled, the last vestiges of their united front crumbled. The anonymous lawyer in the gray suit, seeing that his clients were beyond saving and that his presence now only implicated him, slipped out a side door, his phone already pressed to his ear. He was cutting his losses. The two security guards by the bar, the ones who had been a symbol of our containment, exchanged a nervous look. This was no longer a simple security detail. It was the scene of a corporate crime. They were not paid enough to be accessories. Silently, they abandoned their posts, melting back toward the foyer, leaving the exits unguarded. The physical cage had dissolved, but a far more binding legal one had just been locked. I let them read the first page of the resolution before I added my final condition. "One more thing," I said, and every head snapped up. "There will be a press release issued tonight, before the markets open in Asia. It will announce the company's renewed commitment to transparency and the immediate launch of a full internal audit into our disbursement protocols. It will be framed as a proactive step to ensure shareholder confidence. I paused, letting them absorb the full implication of my words. I will have final approval on the text before it is released. I had taken their power. I had taken their company. Now I was taking their story. Vivian stared at me, her face a mask of utter devastation. The fight was gone, replaced by the hollow look of complete and total defeat. She looked at Cole, the son of her brother, who had stood by my side and handed out the instruments of her destruction. Then she looked back at me, the outsider who had dismantled her life's work in the space of an hour. "You've killed us," she said, her voice a dead, empty whisper. "You've destroyed this family." I looked at her, at the wreckage of her ambition and greed, and I felt nothing but a cold, clean certainty. The pity I thought I might feel was absent. I was a risk manager, and I had just neutralized the single greatest threat to the company's survival. "No, Vivian," I replied, my voice as calm and steady as a surgeon's hand. "You were the disease, you and Beck. You were killing this company, this family, from the inside out with your corruption and your lies." I looked around the room, at the stunned faces, the signed documents, the new reality taking hold. "I didn't kill anything," I said. "I just saved what was left to save." The room was a courtroom, and I had just become the judge. The documents Cole had distributed were the verdicts, waiting only for a signature to become law. All eyes turned to Beck. He was the first named in the resolution, the first to be put to the test. He stood, a hollowed-out version of the man who had started the evening, and walked to the heavy mahogany table in the center of the room as if walking to a scaffold. Cole placed a pen in front of him, a heavy, expensive fountain pen, the kind Grandfather Calder gave out for Christmas. Beck picked it up, his hand trembling so violently that the nib rattled against the cap. He uncapped it, his knuckles white. The close-up on the document camera showed the tip of the pen hovering over the signature line. He tried to write his name, but his hand shook, creating a spidery, hesitant line. The final stroke of his last name was a jagged smear, the wet ink smudging as his sweaty palm dragged across it. It was the signature of a broken man. He pushed the paper away and collapsed back into his chair, covering his face with his hands. One down. Then, Vivian. She had been standing as still as a statue, her face a mask of stone. She did not move toward the table. She looked at the document that had been placed before her, then at me. A final, defiant spark ignited in her eyes. "No," she said, her voice low and hard. "I will not sign." It was her last stand, a refusal to be the author of her own demise. She was daring me to do my worst, believing, perhaps, that there was still some line I would not cross. She was wrong. Cole didn't even look at her. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, black digital audio recorder, the receiver for the microphone he had planted. He walked to the table and placed it next to her unsigned resolution. He pressed a single button. The room was instantly filled with the sound of Vivian's own voice, a harsh, venomous whisper, made monstrous by the amplification. "Get her to sign it now. Just get the signature, and I'll have it lock her out of the system completely. End it." He pressed the button again, and silence rushed back in, more damning than the sound itself. He had just played her intent to the entire room, not a corporate maneuver, not a family disagreement, a premeditated, malicious act to defraud and silence me. It was a confession, in her own voice. Something inside Vivian broke. The defiant spark in her eyes died, leaving behind only the gray ash of defeat. Her shoulders, held rigid for so long, slumped. She walked to the table, pulled out the chair, and sat down heavily. Her movements were slow, robotic, the actions of someone whose will had been amputated. She picked up the pen. The document camera was still on, projecting her every move onto the wall for the room to see. The pen touched the paper. She signed her name, Vivian Calder. The V was a sharp, angry gash, its final stroke elongated and cutting deep into the paper, the telltale sign of a signature written under duress, Under pressure, the sign my father had taught me to look for, the signature of a liar in a hurry. She had signed away her power. Now it was time for me to sign my own. I walked to the table, took the fully executed resolution, and placed it under the camera. Then I took the pen from her unresisting fingers. Beside the resolution, I placed a new document, my updated employment contract, granting me the full authority and oversight we had just ratified. I signed my name, Sloane Keaton, my hand perfectly steady. The K was sharp, decisive, an upward stroke of victory. I left the image of my signature on the screen and turned to face the room. As per the resolution you have all just witnessed and ratified, I announced, my voice ringing with an authority they could no longer question. Arclight Meridian is officially committed to a new standard of radical transparency. I glanced at my watch. This policy is effective as of 21:07 right now. At that exact moment, a vibration came from my phone on the podium. I picked it up. The screen glowed with a new message notification. From Melissa Tran, Greybridge Chronicle. To anonymous source. Received. We're running with it. Front page of the digital edition in 5 minutes. The consequences were no longer theoretical. The story was out. The world was now watching. My gaze lifted from my phone and swept across the room until it found what it was looking for. A small, dark dome mounted on the ceiling in the corner. A security camera. Their security camera. I looked directly into its lens, knowing that somewhere a hard drive was spinning, recording every second of this. Thank you for always saving the tapes, I said, my voice clear and calm. It was a message to the IT department, to the board, and to the ghost of Grandfather Calder himself. Your own system is my witness. As if my words were a cue. The spell that had held the room captive was broken. The large French doors, opened by the caterer what felt like a lifetime ago, let in a sudden gust of cold night air, rustling the signed papers on the table. The change in atmosphere was palpable. The crisis was over. The fallout was beginning. The guests, the managers, the non-board family members began to move. There was no grand exodus, just a quiet, hurried dispersal. They avoided my eyes, murmuring clipped excuses as they retrieved their coats and slipped out into the night, abandoning the Calders to the wreckage they had created. They moved away from the epicenter of the explosion, a tide of self-preservation pulling them back to safer shores. In moments, the great room was nearly empty. Only a few core family members remained, standing like statues in a ruin, and Vivian and Beck, still seated at the table, prisoners of their own making. The auditors had disconnected, their work just beginning. Cole came to my side, his presence a warm, solid anchor in the cold, empty room. His hand found mine, his fingers lacing through my own in a firm, reassuring grip. He looked around at the silent devastation, then back at me, a flicker of pride and relief in his eyes. It's done, he whispered, his voice full of a weary finality. I squeezed his hand back, grateful for his strength, for his unwavering belief in me. He saw the signed papers, the vacant chairs, the transfer of power, and he saw an ending, but he was wrong. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the reckoning. I shook my head slightly, my eyes still fixed on Vivian's slumped form. We're not finished, I said, my voice a low, determined whisper. Not until they apologize. An apology wasn't just a word. It was a legal and moral correction of the record. Power wasn't about revenge. It was about resetting the truth to its factory settings. I looked at Vivian, not with hatred, but with the dispassionate focus of an auditor closing out a fraudulent account. There is one final transaction for this evening, I said, my voice cutting through the funereal silence of the room. I walked over to the security camera, the small dark dome that had been my silent witness, and gestured toward it. Vivian, on your feet. She didn't move. She seemed rooted to the chair, a queen glued to a throne that was already in ashes. Now, I said. The word was not a request. Cole moved to stand behind her chair, a silent, imposing presence. She rose slowly, her joints seeming to creak with the effort. "You will stand here," I said, indicating a spot directly under the camera's unblinking gaze. "You will look at that lens, and you will state, for the permanent corporate and family record, the following words." I paused, letting her feel the weight of her impending statement. I recited the words from memory, the apology I had written in my head a dozen times. "You will say, I, Vivian Calder, formally retract all accusations made against Sloane Keaton this evening. I apologize for the baseless allegations and for my role in the premeditated fabrication of evidence intended to wrongfully terminate her employment." She stared at me, her face a canvas of disbelief and fury. "You cannot be serious." "I have never been more serious in my life," I replied calmly. "This isn't for me, Vivian. It's for the record. It's for the auditors, for the board, and for any future lawsuit you might be tempted to file. It's the final entry in tonight's ledger, acknowledgement of fault." She looked around for an ally, for someone to intervene, but the few remaining family members stared at their shoes. They were powerless, and they knew it. Her last hope was gone. She turned, her movements stiff with rage, and faced the camera. She opened her mouth, and for a moment, I thought she would scream, or curse, or refuse one last time. Instead, she began to speak, her voice a monotone, each word a stone she was forced to swallow. "I, Vivian Calder, formally retract all accusations made against Sloane Keaton this evening." She took a ragged breath. "I apologize for the baseless allegations and for my role in the premeditated fabrication of evidence intended to wrongfully terminate her employment." As she spoke the last word, I felt a knot I didn't even know I was carrying in my chest finally unravel. It wasn't triumph I felt, but a profound, cleansing relief. The weight of their lies, which I had been carrying for months, was finally lifted. She had spoken the truth into the machine, and the machine would not forget. "Thank you," I said, the words as crisp and final as the closing of a bank vault. "You may sit." She stumbled back to her chair, all the fight gone out of her. I returned to the table. Lying there were two documents: the severance agreement they had tried to force on me and my new, ratified employment contract. I picked up the severance agreement, tore it cleanly in half, and let the pieces fall to the floor. Then, I picked up my contract and signed the final page, the one that affirmed my full access, my expanded authority, and my absolute veto power over any expenditure that triggered my risk algorithms. I was no longer just the director of risk management, I was the failsafe. Beck, who had been watching this all unfold with the vacant stare of a shell-shocked soldier, finally stirred. He pushed himself to his feet and approached me, his hands held up in a placating gesture. "Sloane, can we just talk? For a minute? In private?" I didn't even look at him. I was already on my phone, addressing an email. "No, Beck," I said, my tone flat and dismissive. "Your employment is suspended, effective immediately, pending the outcome of the formal investigation. Our next conversation will be in a conference room, and it will be with legal counsel present. We're done here." He recoiled as if I had slapped him. I hit send, a copy of the signed resolution, with its new power structure and Beck's suspension, was now in the inboxes of the head of HR and the internal audit team. I looked up at the ornate grandfather clock against the far wall. Its polished brass pendulum swung back and forth, marking the time, 21:15. In just over an hour, I had dismantled a dynasty and rebuilt a company. As if triggered by some invisible timer, the house's automated sound system came back to life. A soft, instrumental jazz piece began to play, the same inoffensive music from the start of the party, but now it sounded grotesque, a funeral dirge playing in a morgue. The music was for a party that had never happened, for a celebration that was now awake. A caterer, unsure of what else to do, walked to the pristine white cake, the silent prop in this corporate drama. He picked up a silver knife and made the first cut. The slice was perfect, clean. He placed it on a porcelain plate and set it on the table, an offering to ghosts. No one moved toward it. No one would ever eat a piece of that cake. It was a monument to a lie, and no one was hungry. Cole walked over to the large glass doors that led to the terrace. With a quiet click, he unlocked them and slid one open. A wave of cool, clean night air washed into the room, cutting through the cloying, artificial scent of cedarwood that had permeated the house, the smell of real life, of damp earth and distant city lights. "Real air," he said, his voice a low murmur of relief. I walked toward him, away from the table, away from the torn paper and the signed confessions. I didn't look back at Vivian or Beck. Their part in my story was over. I stepped across the threshold, from the stale, conditioned air of their gilded cage into the crisp, boundless air of the night. It felt like my first breath after being held underwater for a very, very long time. The oppressive scent of cedarwood was gone, replaced by the simple, honest smell of the outdoors. There was nothing left to say. The evidence had spoken. The signatures had spoken. The recording had spoken. Their silence now spoke volumes. The truth had been established. The accounts had been settled, and the power had been transferred. There was no need for another word in that room. Stepping out onto the terrace was like surfacing for air. The cold night was a baptism, washing away the recycled, cedar-scented atmosphere of the great room. Behind me was a scene of devastation, a silent, sterile battlefield where careers had been ended and a dynasty had been brought to its knees. But out here, under the vast, indifferent sky, there was only the quiet hum of the world moving on. I took a deep, cleansing breath, the first one that didn't feel like I was stealing it. I pulled out my phone, its screen a stark rectangle of light in the darkness. My fingers moved with a newfound purpose, no longer typing defensive strategies but issuing commands. I dialed the direct line for ArcLight's head of IT, a man named Kenji who worked late and missed nothing. He answered on the first ring. "Kenji, it's Sloan Keaton." There was a pause, then, "Sloan, I heard there was a meeting." His voice was cautious, professional, but I could hear the undercurrent of curiosity. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't know the new configuration of the board. "There was," I said, my tone leaving no room for discussion. "I'm calling with a directive. My system access. It's to be fully restored. All administrative privileges, all oversight protocols, effective immediately. You'll find the signed resolution from the board authorizing it in your inbox in about 5 minutes." "Understood," he said, the caution in his voice replaced by a brisk efficiency. He was a man who respected a clear chain of command, and I had just established it. "And Kenji," I added, "one more thing. I want you to initiate a live forensic audit on the executive servers. Start with the CFO and COO office terminals. I want a complete data capture of all activity for the last 90 days. I want every deleted file, every cached document, every keystroke. I'm not interested in a summary tomorrow. I want to see the raw data spooling in real time when I arrive in the morning. Lock all other users out of the audit logs, except for me and you." "A live audit," he repeated, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. Kenji was a true believer in the purity of data. He had just been handed a divine mandate to go hunting for sinners. "Consider it done. Sloan, welcome back." "I never left," I said, and ended the call. My next action was just as swift. I opened my email client and drafted a new message. The recipient was the all-employees distribution list. Every single person at ArcLight Meridian, from the warehouse floor to the international sales desks. The subject line I typed was simple, direct, and promised a new era. Statement of transparency. The body of the email was brief. It announced the board's unanimous decision to implement a new phase of radical corporate transparency. It mentioned an immediate internal review of all accounting and disbursement protocols to ensure the company was operating at the highest possible standard of integrity. It did not name names. It did not need to. The news of Beck's suspension and Vivian's neutering would travel through the corporate grapevine at the speed of light. This email was not the news. It was the new law of the land. the official narrative under which the news would be understood. I attached the press release I had already drafted, the one Melissa Tran was now formatting for the Chronicle's front page. I hit send. The message flew out into the digital ether, a declaration of independence for a company that had, for too long, been a kingdom. I finally allowed myself to relax, the tension flowing out of my shoulders. I turned to Cole, who was leaning against the stone balustrade, watching me with a quiet, knowing smile. "See," I said, a weary smile of my own touching my lips. "A birthday party can be a wonderful thing, as long as the right person gets to blow out the candles." He chuckled, a low, warm sound in the cool night air. "I told you it was a trap," he said, his eyes full of a deep, unshakable pride. "You just rebaited it with a better class of poison." My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message. It was from the interim CEO, a quiet, no-nonsense veteran of the logistics world named Arthur Vance, a man who had been sidelined by the Calders for years. "Sloan, just read the resolution. Well done. I'll be waiting for you in the office at 7 a.m. We have work to do." It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons from an ally. The first gear of the new machine beginning to turn, I typed a simple, "See you then." And for the first time that night, I turned my phone off. The silence was a luxury. I slipped the dark screen into my clutch and leaned against the cold stone beside Cole, looking out over the manicured lawns and beyond, toward the distant glow of the city, Greybridge. The name had always felt appropriate for the Calders' world, a place of ambiguity, of murky ethics and indistinct loyalties, a bridge between nothing and nowhere. In my mind, I pictured another city, a place I would build, Stoneford, a name that felt solid, grounded, a foundation, a safe crossing. Behind us, in the great room, the projector, which had been the instrument of both their attack and their defeat, finally gave up. The fan whirred down into silence, and the bright rectangle of light on the wall winked out. With the light gone, the shadows rushed back in, reclaiming the room. Vivian's face, which had been a mask of fury and then defeat, was now just a silhouette, a shape in the darkness, already becoming a memory. The party was over. I reached out and took Cole's hand. His fingers closed around mine, strong and sure. We didn't say another word. We turned our backs on the house, on the silent figures sitting in the dark, on the uneaten cake and the ghost of a celebration. We walked, side by side, down the wide stone steps that led away from the terrace and into the quiet dark of the lawn. The heavy glass door slid shut behind us, the lock engaged with a soft, final click. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know your thoughts, and for fun, comment down below where in the world you're listening from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And if you really want to support what I do, hitting that hype button helps more than you know, allowing this story to be heard by so many others. Thank you again for being here.